Welcome back to the course Literature of the Ancient Near East. I'm Dr. Justin Singleton. Leaping from an understanding of geographical time aspects of topography and climate comes an appreciation of what those geographical elements produced, namely resources for security, sustenance, and labor. These can be referred to as the products of lands and waters, creating lifeways for individuals and societies. And as geographical time changes slowly, so the products of these changed over time as humanity furthered their own knowledge of the post-flood world around them, including resources for security, such as those pertaining to housing, clothing, and defense, to resources for sustenance, such as fertile soils, fresh water, and foodstuffs, to resources for industrial needs, including stone, clay, wood, and volcanic materials. Now, before these can be understood, certain limitations need to be set upon both the geography and the chronology of the ancient Near East. Otherwise, one can always just add a little more, constantly broadening the scope of the study. It should be noted that Egypt is not always included in the Near East, except when its empire is extended into Asia. But as Egyptian history intersected with the Near East regularly, it is included here. Generally speaking, the Near East consists of roughly 2 million squared kilometers, and as such is a pretty large geographical area. Thus, the ancient Near East, what some refer to as the Fertile Crescent, is defined geographically as the area from the Zagros and Elburz mountains to the east, following the Tigris and Euphrates rivers north to right before the Caucasus, bending around to the Black Sea, and then finally down the eastern Mediterranean. In modern terms, the Near East includes the countries of Israel, Lebanon, Syria, part of Turkey, Iraq, and Iran, but probably also Jordan, Palestine, Cyprus, and Armenia. Diachronically, that's through time, the history of the ancient Near East can be confusing. Some scholars delimit the ancient Near East in terms of linguistics, beginning with the advent of writing and ending with the foundations of the linguistically invasive Persian Empire, thus extending from around 3500 to 500 BC, separating ancient from both the prehistoric and the preclassical or classical eras. Still others date the ancient Near East from about the Chalcolithic period or Copper Age until the conquest by Muslim Arabs, thus from around 5000 BC to roughly AD 700. Now, although a complete history of the ancient Near East must commence at the beginning of time, mentioning the earliest archaeological examples rather than limiting the starting point, for the purposes of this study, that starting point will begin with a brief overview of the Stone Age. As for when the ancient Near East ends and the next era begins, it seems prudent not to include invasive cultures, those from outside sources that heavily influence the ancient world, including the Persian, Greek, and Roman cultures. And therefore, this study will end at the foundations of the Persian Empire. Now, this broad geographical area and rather long time frame necessarily includes very many different peoples and cultures. Because so many different people groups and cultures existed over the span of the scope of the study, this work is going to be, and when I say this work, I mean this class, is going to be limited to major geographical areas and specific key cultural groups. These groups will include the Canaanites and Phoenicians, the Egyptians, Akkadians, Elamites, Assyrians and Babylonians, and of course the Israelites. But these will not include the Hittites, Ammonites, Moabites, Edomites, or Philistines, except when directly related to the former groups. By limiting the scope of this work, a broad overview of the ancient Near East as it relates to the biblical world can be understood. Maybe I'll add more people groups in later semesters. In this next section, we'll talk about ancient Near Eastern resources, beginning with the Stone Age. Now, the concept of an Ugg cave dweller should not only be ignored, but forgotten altogether. The Stone Age, so-called Stone Age, in the ancient Near East and beyond, although beginning in the Paleolithic, which is claimed to have contained the product of the evolution of mankind from his non-Homo nomenclated ancestors, was extremely complex with what might be considered modern ideas concerning societal programs, burials, foods, and other lifeways. Paleolithic art in Sicily at the Adura cave is not only impressive, it's arguably better than very many could do today, containing evidence of extremely complex beliefs and rituals like those involving dancing, and these from so-called cavemen. Now, this is not to argue that Stone Age cultures were technologically advanced. In fact, although socially complex, life in the Stone Age was pretty harsh, often environmentally brutal. The difficult climatological changes likely delayed technological advances, as it limited growth, major advances only taking place once the climate began to stabilize at the beginning of the Neolithic period. Nonetheless, humanity survived and progressed in spite of the hardships. One must understand that the Stone Age in the Near East was a point in time on the heels of environmental change, including alternating periods of warm and dry conditions and cold and humid climates, stemming from the end of the ever-changing glacial ages. Because of these alternations, early human activities in the region were sparse. But as the climate began to stabilize, so the habitat of wild grasses expanded, allowing for greater ease in collection, eventually giving way to sedentary, non-cave-dwelling communities. This move from caves to manufactured caves, what we might call huts or houses, developed from need, as was the case in the move from the Zagros Mountains to the fertile plains of Mesopotamia, where crops could be maintained, but cave dwelling was no longer an option. This concept matches the general move of most, if not all, civilizations from caves to non-cave dwellings, mainly the desire to be closer to one's fields for both ease of maintenance and protection of those resources. Whether those be wild fields that became domesticated, or even specific grazing fields where meat could be harvested. Over time, fields of wild cereals would become domesticated, eventually resulting in purposefully planted fields and the beginning of horticulture. Houses were then often built of clay and wood, sometimes with stone foundations, and although villages did exist, many of these early houses can be thought of more as farmsteads rather than villages. A sedentary family's struggle against nature. This move toward agriculture brought about other changes as well, such as those involving clothing. Before agriculture, living in the harsh climate of a glacial environment meant that clothing came primarily from animal skins, complex clothing being formed by cutting animal hides into desired shapes with stone blades, piercing them with bone awls, and then sewing them together with bone needles. With the now abundant fibrous materials from agricultural surplus in a post-glacial environment, other forms of clothing components could be created, such as linen from flax and felt from wool. To make life even easier, the loom was created, making the weaving of materials more practical and officially developing new standards for clothing designs. Interestingly, one argument concerning agriculture is that Rather than textiles being a result of agricultural surplus, the move to agriculture came about in order specifically to obtain the fibrous materials needed for which to create clothing. In the post-glacial climate, when the temperatures were warmer and the humidity higher, clothing made from non-porous skins created a sweat and moisture problem. And as textiles were used in the last glacial period to insulate leather garments as kind of like a type of thermal protection, like a thermal underwear outside of the shelter, the move to textiles alone was already an option. The period in Near Eastern history where the domestication of animals, adaptation of agriculture, and the rise of villages takes place is often referred to as the Neolithic Revolution. And this brought about a consolidation of domesticated species of both plants and animals, resulting in a demographic rise in the region. Now, this was a cereal-based economy, expanding out from the Fertile Crescent, the main caloric intake coming primarily from emmer, einkorn, wheat, and barley, but protein could be gained from pulses such as chickpeas and lentils. Additionally, by the Chalcolithic, olives became important for their oil, and grapes had been introduced from the Caucasus. In addition to proteinic pulses, animal flesh provided protein. Now, it's not understood to what extent animals made up the diet of primitive humanity, but ethnoarchaeological studies show that hunter-gatherer tribes today consume on average a ratio of about 30% animal and 70% vegetable, though this changes to an almost complete animal diet in extremely cold regions. One can assume that glacial diets included plenty of meat, and as the switch to agriculture occurred, domestication took place, including animals such as sheep and goat early on, and then pig and cattle later. As early domesticators unconsciously chose what animals to keep, the shift in habitat automatically created drastic generational changes in the species, ultimately resulting in genetic mutations away from aspects vital to survival in the wild and toward domestic traits seen today. By the end of the Stone Age, irrigation technologies were created in Lower Mesopotamia to maximize the agricultural yield. This increased yield then resulted in even more people coming to the land. And this then resulted in a gradual process of social, ideological, and even economic change. The introduction of farming also brought about new tools and needed resources, such as the development of sickles and heavier grinding stones, but also baskets, pits, and other types of facilities needed to store the excess goods for later consumption. One of the most important developments at this time was the creation of pottery, the construction of which is specifically linked to agricultural need, particularly allowing for both short-term and long-term storage of agricultural goods that simply couldn't be stored in any other way. This major invention of mankind then splits the Neolithic period, marking pre-pottery from pottery Neolithic, establishing a new societal nomenclature for scholars today. Becoming agriculturally focused societies, certain types of tools diminished in use, such as arrowheads used in hunting, while agriculturally related tools grew in number. In fact, it's believed that the process of harvesting crops may have played a role in what plants to domesticate, those more types of non-shattering grains being preferred over those grains that would shatter when they're harvested. In smaller villages, these new tools, as well as pottery, were crafted by the families who used them. But in larger communities, the demand for these tools led to the development of specialists who focused on the manufacture of specific types of tools, whether stone, bone, or ceramic. These newly acquired skills, referred to as craft specializations, then led to better quality items, objects that could not be created on a household level. Whereas throughout much of the Stone Age, individual families struggled for resources, In the Bronze Age, this was a broader communal struggle for survival. As harvests varied from year to year, individual farmsteads were only scarcely viable, thus creating a need for individuals to combine their resources, developing into the first villages, towns, and even cities. In Mesopotamia, this transition occurred earlier than elsewhere, noting societal changes accelerating during the very end of the Stone Age. Continuing the irrigation technology first implemented earlier, the city of Uruk in southern Mesopotamia and the region around it became more agriculturally productive than other regions, resulting by the late Uruk period in a rapid increase of settlements being established in the area as differing peoples migrated into the land in order to participate in the abundance. Due to the administrative and economic advances that needed to be developed to maintain order, the first state-level societies were created, and these included the organization of temple-based religions. By the end of the 4th millennium BC, these major changes are found throughout the Near East. In Egypt, as well as in Mesopotamia, literate civilizations developed, including complex governmental systems and hierarchies of social, religious, and administrative classes, organizing for the first time large-scale public initiatives such as monumental architecture. While the first state-level societies were created in Mesopotamia quite early on, in the Levant, this move from small unwalled villages to walled cities took much longer. Beginning in the early Bronze I, and only finally reaching the point of Mesopotamian-style cities during early Bronze III, including fortifications and public buildings. In Egypt, the early Bronze period includes early urbanization, though, as in Mesopotamia, these urban centers existed independently from each other in the beginning. The beginning of the 3rd millennium BC saw transformation in society from individual ruling communities to the first true territorial state, headed by divine kingship, including the first dynasties of Egypt. The first king to bring the entirety of the land together, at least according to later Egyptian records, is Narmer, though the joining of Egyptian polities occurred much earlier, and the founding of the kingdom was much more complex than just one man. Key to Bronze Age developments are the dual agricultural spheres of cultivation and husbandry. From the Stone Age, the Levant, Mesopotamia, Anatolian Cyprus became intertwined with each other as agriculture spread across the region. In the Levant, agriculture, along with horticulture and herding, was the basis of all Bronze Age societies. And although there's a question as to the origin of agriculture in the Levant, it's likely that many of the material cultural differences between the Chalcolithic and Bronze Age originated from new peoples moving into the region, or at least from cultural contacts. Specifically, Bronze Age changes to agricultural methods appear to have stemmed from a twofold cultural contact with the outside. First, contact between Mesopotamia and the northern Levant is clear, pulling Mesopotamian ideals into the Levant. Second, cultural affinities between the southern Levant and the Kura-Araxes tradition of the Caucasus suggest a Caucasian presence in the Levant at the beginning of the Bronze Age. These migrants bringing with them new traditions adapted from early trade with the Uruk expansive trade network that existed during the end of the Stone Age. In fact, the Levant continuously at this time received the cultural effects of Mesopotamian events, even if those came secondarily through other cultures. Of those new agricultural methods, irrigation, first being developed in Mesopotamia and used extensively there, although practiced earlier in the Levant, became widely adopted in the early Bronze Age. Additionally, the plow, first created in Mesopotamia to improve cultivation, allowed for extensive cultivation in the Levant. Fruit trees, too, being domesticated around the same time that agriculture began and existing earlier than the Uruk period, gained a heavy emphasis in the Levant during the early Bronze Age. It would appear that the Mesopotamian ripples greatly influenced the Levantine cultures. Unfortunately, throughout the 3rd millennium BC, much of the northern hemisphere entered into a drying phase, culminating at its driest around 2000 BC. Throughout the millennium-long early Bronze Age in Mesopotamia, it's estimated that between 5 and 10 major climatic events occurred, causing droughts that lasted 6 years or longer. And the fact that these cities actually survived these times, it really is a testament to their leadership. Of note, barley, the crop of choice in ancient Mesopotamia, is both drought and salinity resistant. And although whether a king or simply some observant farmer chose the crop is unknown, it was up to the centralized government to store and maintain agricultural surpluses. Grain storage became key for survival, and just as in Mesopotamia, other regions would need strong central governments to continue existence. In Egypt, this would lead to the Old Kingdom. In Levant, these centralized authorities developed into types of proto-city-states where cities held sway over their peripheral territories, leading to competition and ultimately to attempts to expand territorial influences during a time in which resources simply weren't stable. These climatic changes played a major role in the demise of the Old Kingdom in Egypt, and the same can be said of the Akkadian Empire in Mesopotamia. Though rainfall throughout the Chalcolithic and early Bronze Age increased in the Levant, rain-fed agriculture is notoriously inconsistent. And the early Bronze Canaanites at this time simply couldn't compensate for the long-term climatic changes occurring, bringing a climatic end to the southern Levantine proto-city-states as well. Because of the climate catastrophe throughout the early Bronze Age, major advances became necessary for survival. One of these advances was the emergence of literacy in and around Mesopotamia. Literacy acting as a necessity for administrative centers, where record keeping allowed for better supervision and oversight of the dwindling resources. In fact, it's from these records that historians today are able to understand ancient practices, administrative hierarchies, and even belief systems. By the Middle Bronze Age, which has been termed by some as the dawn of internationalism, the Levant came to use consistently the potter's wheel, which had been around with sporadic use in Mesopotamia since the 4th millennium. The rather primitive slow wheel, where the potter shaped, turned, until the vessel was complete, had been utilized in the Levant throughout the early Bronze Age. But with a growing population during the Middle Bronze Age, the fast wheel, which had been used to mass-produce pottery during the Uruk period in Mesopotamia, was adapted to use in the Levant, creating a new repertoire of advanced and sophisticated pottery and creating something of a standardized material culture. Along with the fast wheel came better clay refining techniques, different firing temperatures, more consistent inclusions within the clay, and a change in the application of an external slip upon the ceramics, ultimately creating more varied and finer vessels. Now, lessening the time it takes to create pottery, which is what the fast wheel did, ultimately led to flourishing local industries such as working with gypsum to create plaster, and the development of bone and ivory inlays. And as these craft specializations were developed, there came an increase in international trade, including both tin and ceramics, and even more technological progression. Perhaps a characterization of the late Bronze Age is that of multiple confrontations. While the Middle Bronze Age began on the heels of the early Bronze drying phase, the Late Bronze Age saw its own climatic issues, such as a shift in annual precipitation that caused a continual strain upon the region's inhabitants over several generations, and was the likely cause of the collapse of the Mycenaean palatial system. As the Late Bronze Age became more of a period of internationalism than the previous Middle Bronze Age, so conflicts occurred throughout the Near East, particularly between the Hittites, Mitannians, Egyptians, and Assyrians, all major civilizations of the time. Something occurred at the end of the Bronze Age that changed the entire Near East, specifically the Bronze Age collapse. This collapse of civilization occurred over a period of time generally understood to extend from around 1315 to 1190 BC, and is seen as the collapse of the palatial or palace system introduced by the Mycenaeans, and of course the collapse of those civilizations that in turn were affected by palatial systems. As one civilization collapsed, the remnants then placed pressure on their neighbors, causing war, devastation, and furthering the climatological stress of major droughts that all groups already felt. By the Iron Age, the entirety of the Near East and Egypt had gone through a series of transmutations from the use of stone apparatuses as primary tools to states with imperial ambitions. It would appear that the move from familial struggles for resources in a Stone Age to communal struggles for resources in a Bronze Age would find a culmination in state struggles for state struggles for resources in the Iron Age, even if those resources belonged to other states. By the Imperial Age, strategies for resource exploitation included simply conquering a people and taking theirs. The Iron Age began in response to the Bronze Age collapse, allowing for the establishment of a series of small states, if only for a few centuries. In the Levant, these small states included Ammon, Moab, Edom in the Transjordan, and Israel and Philistia in the Cisjordan. To the north, the Phoenician coast, although never a true state, had for the most part survived the collapse. In Mesopotamia, the Iron Age saw the rise and fall of several empires, the armies of which would eventually conquer the lesser Levantine states. Perhaps the most important of the Mesopotamian empires during this time were the Neo-Assyrian and Neo-Babylonian empires, powers that would spread across the Near East and squeeze the Levant between themselves and Egypt, a state that would enter into its third intermediate period during this time. During the Bronze and Iron Age transition, destructions are seen from the Black Sea to Egypt, and the major Mediterranean trade network founded by the Mycenaeans had collapsed. The collapse of these major trade networks and the smaller trading sites that supplied resources to the greater ones necessarily meant that those sites dependent upon foreign materials, such as copper and tin, also experienced a failed economy. In the Eastern Mediterranean, sites such as Ugarit and Telsucus in the north, Hatzor and Akko in the south, and Enkami in the west on the island of Cyprus were destroyed. But resting peacefully in the middle of these sites was the Phoenician coast, and sites such as Tyre and Sidon appear to have survived the desolation. It was Tyre, the Phoenician city-state, that would go on to replace the lost Bronze Age trade emporia. Now, it should be noted that Phoenicia, as I said before, is not a state or a nation. Instead, like Sumer, it's a geographical region. In this case, a region along the Mediterranean coast in the northern Levant, basically between Mount Carmel and Arvad, somewhat secluded from the world due to two large mountain ranges to the east. The land of Phoenicia occupied a rather strategic place in the eastern Mediterranean, linking the three continents of Europe, Asia, and Africa, and this link was utilized quite early. 11th and 10th century Phoenician pottery appearing in Cypriot graves at Kidian, Amathus, and Paphos. Interestingly, a Phoenician settlement at Hulva, Spain, known to the Greeks as Tartessos, dates quite early, possibly as early as the mid-900s BC, roughly to the time of Solomon. And Necho II of Egypt may have, at least according to Herodotus, requested that the Phoenicians circumnavigate Africa around 600 BC. Tyrian ships were able to export cedar, wine, honey, balm, spices, olive oil, cereals, fruits, and more, and the Phoenicians helped to propagate chicken, donkeys, cats, and even rabbits, as well as spreading plant cultivars such as citrus, reed, flax, and pomegranate. Living on the semi-periphery of both Egypt and Assyria, the Phoenician cities could trade with these great societies and beyond, collecting resources along the way from newly established Phoenician settlements, who no doubt gathered resources from indigenous groups. Phoenician ships spread across the sea, establishing major settlements with good harbor at sites all across the Mediterranean, possibly a move taken to counter the growing Greek colonization of places such as Sicily. One such site, Carthage, shows evidence of tithes paid to the temple of Melkart, Baal, in Tyre, thus enriching Tyre as well as themselves, Tyre becoming the key economic core of the Phoenician coast. The Phoenician cities remained quite comfortable on their northern Levantine homeland early on, and their mutual economic treaty with the then combined nation of Israel under the famed King Solomon no doubt enriched both regions. It wasn't until the later Assyrian Empire demanded tribute that the Phoenicians really felt the pressure of the outside world. In fact, as the Assyrian Empire expanded their territorial control, the Assyrians had to rely on external sources to meet their own demands, depending on Eastern Mediterranean cultural groups such as Arab, Philistine, and Phoenician traders to gather the needed resources from far-off regions such as Spain, Nubia, and Arabia. Interestingly, it was likely the Phoenicians who brought the 9th century Assyrians, through Tiglath-Pileser I, into a technological modernity. Unfortunately for the Phoenician coastal cities, Assyrian expansion into the general Phoenician area of the Levant meant that Assyria would begin to change its relationship with Tyre from trade partner to overlord. With this change in status, Assyria required the Phoenicians now simply to pay the Assyrians rather than exchanging goods. And as Assyria conquered parts of the southern Levant, namely the northern nation of Israel and parts of Judah, the Phoenician cities could now see firsthand what denying the Assyrians could actually look like. Notedly, iron innovation in the Levant appears at least somewhat to have been a result of the Bronze Age collapse, particularly as iron-bearing people groups moved into the Near East after or during the Bronze Age collapse. Consistent ironworking originating in Anatolia, likely by the Hittites, was then adapted by the Sea Peoples, who had helped Egypt in their attack on the Hittites, but who had been in the Anatolian region since the late Bronze Age, being referred to by the Hittite king as boat people. Iron use in the Levant was then transplanted from Anatolia shortly after 1200 BC through the migration of the Sea Peoples, in particular the Philistines, changing the shape of warfare forever. Of note, meteoric iron had already been worked sporadically by the beginning of the 4th millennium, and instances of meteoric iron weapons are clear, such as the famed iron dagger of Tutankhamun, and likely the iron club of Areithius, mentioned in the Iliad. Iron only became commonly used by the 10th century though bronze was still the predominant metal. And it wasn't until around 600 BC that iron saw widespread use across the entire Near East. The move to ironworking appears to have been an economic change, as iron ore was said to be more commonly available. Deuteronomy 8:9 hyperbolically noted that the land of Canaan was so bountiful that even the stones were made of iron. Previously, copper was made available through trade, primarily with Cyprus, as Egypt held control over copper mines in the Negev and Sinai. The collapse of the trade economy at the end of the Bronze Age meant that metal tools and weapons, rather than a return to stone, necessarily were to be made from more available materials. This may be due to either a lack of trade or possibly an aversion to it, as some polities may have desired to decrease foreign contact. Unfortunately, iron materials were more difficult to work. Whereas copper or bronze objects could easily be cast, iron, having a much higher melting point, existing in a more impure form, and having a stronger affinity to oxygen, often needed to be forged one item at a time. Thus, the move to iron, which ended up being stronger than bronze only after proper treatment, including cold tempering, folding, and hammering, was likely not a search for a better material, but rather a move based on need. Well, I hope this lecture has helped. Remember, as always, let me know what you think.